My name's Hacker Bob, and welcome to the very first episode of August 29, 2022. Arizona's Maricopa Police Department respond to a call of a noise disturbance located on the residence of 38-year-old Brian Simmons. On arrival, police are greeted by a seemingly friendly Simmons, although things don't stay friendly for long. The following body cam footage is a cut-down version of the original 20-minute interaction. I must warn, this footage may be disturbing to some viewers.
How's it going, Brian?
Give me a hug.
How you doing, man?
Hey, Ryan.
Hey.
Yep. Everyone ready for the weapons now.
Brian strangely retreats back to a chair he placed in his cluttered driveway. That's when this officer on the left notices that Brian has an axe and two firearms laying next to him.
Oh, this motherfucker pick up an axe.
Hey, Brian! Put them down now!
No! Put it down, no!
Drop the gun, Brian!
No! Come towards me! Put it down!
Brian, put them down now!
Ryan, you gonna have a fucking problem today.
He
Put that down, no!
He has two handguns right by his side. Can we get additional?
The standoff in Brian Simmons' driveway would last almost 5 minutes. Eventually, one of the officers would fire a less than lethal round at Brian, causing him to retreat back into his house.
Get on the ground, Brian! Get on the ground, man! Brian, we will shoot you! Brian? Brian, you've been cool with us! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
He's going inside.
We got it.
Brian would hide in the house for around 3 minutes, but unknown to the officers at the time, Brian was grabbing something. After sneaking out the back door and around the side of the house, Brian approached the officers, this time armed with a shotgun. This would leave officers no other option but to return fire.
Oh! Shit! He's got a shotgun! Shots fired!
You want to run you
Ultimately, Brian would be killed in this shootout, putting an end to his short reign of terror. But who was Brian? A drugged-out maniac? A total nutcase? Well, not exactly. You see, this is where the story takes a dark and tragic turn. Brian Simmons wasn't always an unhinged man. In fact, before he moved to Arizona, Brian worked at the Idaho National Laboratory for over 16 years, 2 years as a security police officer and 14 years as a nuclear facility operator. According to an article posted on courthousenews.com, Brian worked at the Zero Power Physics Reactor in the Materials and Fuels Complex. This is where he took the role of nuclear operator. He regularly handled plutonium and other special nuclear radioactive materials that were shipped or stored on site. According to Simmons, he and his coworkers were not allowed to use personal safety equipment required to handle radioactive materials. He said that in certain situations, they weren't provided safety equipment at all. Simmons warned the director that if things didn't change, the company would eventually be fined and that people would get hurt. Unfortunately, that prediction came true on November 8, 2011, when he and other workers came across damaged fuel plates wrapped in plastic and tape. Despite the inherent damage, Simmons says he was told to repackage the plates, but he stopped when he saw black powder falling from the unwrapped fuel plate. According to Simmons, this would result in the uncontrolled release of radioactive material, resulting in the contamination of 16 workers and the facility. This article was written in 2014, which at the time Simmons had an active lawsuit against the Idaho National Laboratory. Simmons stated that Patel did not provide adequate medical treatment after his exposure, and that he suffered immediate physical harm. And at the time, he also stated that he didn't know what other health complications the future could hold. But we now know that Brian was showing signs of schizophrenia at the time of his death and for some time prior. It should also be stated that it's well known that radiation can cause mental illness. In fact, many of the survivors of the Chernobyl incident also developed schizophrenia-like symptoms. This is thought to be caused by radiation-induced frontotemporal limbic dysfunction. Brian Simmons was eventually able to come to a settlement in his lawsuit, although the damage had already been done. The athletic, funny, and intelligent Simmons would become a shell of himself, moving to Arizona where he would live in clutter for some time, and, well, we all know how that story ends. But I want to leave this story off with another article I found. This one is written from the perspective of one of Brian's friends and former co-workers at the time of the incident. This is an open letter to the people of Maricopa who knew Brian Simmons or followed his story. I am Ralph Stanton. I was Brian's friend and co-worker. We worked at the Zero Power Physics Reactor as nuclear facility operators at the Idaho National Laboratory. The people of Maricopa need to know that Brian's bizarre and schizophrenic behavior was far beyond his control. On November 8, 2011, Brian and I, along with 14 of our co-workers, were exposed to an uncontrolled airborne release of plutonium-239 and americium-241. Since Brian and I were at the point on the release, our exposures were much higher than our co-workers. Due to the level of our exposure, we were put into modest clothing and taken to the site medical facility to have our blood drawn for a CBC count. This is proper medical protocol to verify the severity of the exposure. Our CBC counts revealed that our white blood cells had dropped to 50% in less than 6 hours following our exposure. Our blood markers revealed two things to medical personnel that night. First, according to the REACTS medical training manual used by our employer, Battelle Energy Alliance, we were in a potentially lethal situation. Second, the same blood markers revealed that we were experiencing acute radiation syndrome or radiation poisoning. Knowing that this exposure gave us bone marrow suppression by our CBC counts and put us in danger of infection, the BEA sent us home to ride it out, where we were very sick, vomiting with severe nausea and diarrhea. The following day, when Brian and I met with the lead medical doctor for the BEA, we told him that we had been up all night vomiting with nausea and diarrhea. And without a test or pause, the company doctor then told us that we had influenza. He added that since we carpooled together, one of us already had it and gave it to the other, but neither Brian nor I were sick before the exposure. Unfortunately, Brian nor I had any idea what our blood count meant or that our medical symptoms were radiologically induced. In fact, it was years later before we discovered it. The BEA knew that our radiological injuries were severe. The radiological release that caused these injuries was due to the BEA's gross or willful negligence. This situation brought the potential of civil or criminal liability to BEA. The only way to mitigate that liability was for our employer, the BEA, to falsify our final dose assignments showing very low exposures. The mitigation of this liability also meant that the INL medical department could not treat or acknowledge that any of our clinical symptoms were due to the ZPPR exposure. I can tell you this with confidence, that this high-level, untreated exposure led to Brian's mental illness because of the many studies done on the correlation of schizophrenia and suppressed white blood cell counts. Due to the monitoring of the ARS Chernobyl survivors, we know that all of them developed mental illness. Several of the Chernobyl ARS survivors developed schizophrenia 5 to 10 years after their exposures, like Brian did. As an ARS survivor myself in the ZPPR accident, I developed a mental illness along with many other medical issues tied to this exposure. After this exposure, Brian withdrew completely from his family and friends, and he started to decline mentally. I had not talked to Brian for at least 5 years when he called me out of the blue about a month before his death. It was the same voice, but a completely different person. When I saw the pictures on the news of his belongings strewn across the yard and driveway, I realized how bad off he was. Before this exposure, Brian was very intelligent, organized, happy, full of life, with a bright future ahead of him. I had been to Brian's house many times over the years I worked with him, finding his house to be very clean and organized and his yard manicured. Brian was very close to his family and looked forward to having children of his own, but after the exposure, he knew that being a father was no longer a choice for him. Brian's life was cut short due to greed, and I wish the people of Maricopa who knew Brian would have had the chance to know him before the exposure, because you would have loved him and respected him as many others, and I did. Ralph Stanton, Idaho Falls, Idaho.